with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. Today's webinar is made possible through funding provided by the San Antonio Livestock Exposition Incorporated, and it's hosted by the Texas Wildlife Association and Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. With that, John, I'll pass the controls over to you.
Very good, Clint. Thank you very much. Everybody, welcome to this month's session. I'm pleased that you're all here with me. And if at any point the audio quality goes down, just let us know through the chat window and we will attempt to rectify. Hopefully everybody can hear me fine. I'm going to switch my color for my cursor here. So when we ask ourselves the question of why the heck do I want to identify predation, typically folks say to me, well, John, I think of something like the image on the screen right now. In this kind of scenario, I know what killed that deer. There's a big mountain lion right on top of it. And I always ask them the question of, how do you know? Maybe the lion just came upon it and doesn't want you to touch that kill. In this case, probably not the situation, but goes to the point of in any kind of management, whether you're a livestock raiser or a wildlife manager concerned about the effects of predation, we need to be able to, with some degree of certainty, positively identify what did the killing. Now, kills are tricky and identification of kills is very difficult, but we're going to provide you some tools today to help address that. So the question we encounter, why do I want to identify predation? Everybody always says to me, I saw what I saw, I know what did it, so who cares? Because I know what kills animals like this in my area. Well, the simple fact of the matter is we're not always positive. Sometimes we think we know what's going on, but again, kills are tricky and we need to confirm our suspicions for the simple reason that whatever control or management efforts we make on predatory animals are going to have ecological effects. They're going to change the way the system functions. We're going to start toying with all those moving parts, as well as economic effects. I always think back to a situation where we had a livestock raiser, great guy, worked with him a lot, raised sheep. And he called me at a point. He said, John, I am having incredible coyote predation issues. And I said, okay, tell me what's going on. And he kind of described the scenario, and it didn't really sound like coyote predation. It sounded more like he had some issues with feral dogs or maybe something else. It was hard to say. And I said, well, could you do me a favor? The next time you've got a confirmed kill, would you cover up the carcass and give me a call? I'll come out. And lo and behold, we went out the next time he had a kill. He didn't live on the property. It was pretty fresh, and I looked at it, and I said, well, this tracks more like a feral dog for me, but tell you what, let's put a game camera up and see if we can catch one in the act. So we did. Ended up being a neighbor dog that was coming over, and I said, well, okay, talk with your neighbor about it. And he got very long in the face, and he said, not only have I lost livestock, but I've spent tremendous amounts of money on coyote control, and you're telling me I really didn't need to be. And I said, well, yeah, probably not. So we've got effects, both ecological and economic, and we want to make sure that we're targeting the right animal. So one of the reasons we want to ID. So today, just a brief overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to spend a few minutes talking about how basic signs are critical for wildlife management, whether that's managing predation or whether that's management of ungulates, any kind of species you're managing for. There are a few kinds of basic signs, in my opinion, that are critical for knowing what animals you have and kind of what parts of your property they're using and how it's all shaken out. Next, we're going to talk about general predation signs and clues, if you want to think about it in a more CSI context. The things that we look at. What are the items I want you to key in on when you're attempting to ID a predation? We'll go from there to talking about some specific species characteristics. When a predation occurs from these animals, what does it typically look like? A few things that we can focus on there. We'll spend a few minutes talking about how one goes about critically evaluating a carcass, what process you should go through, what things you should be looking for. And we'll finish up with a brief discussion about gaining more reliable knowledge as time goes on and your experience with identifying kills increases, and what resources are out there to help you learn. Obviously, today's talk is a great starter, but as we'll see here in a few minutes, there's no firm, hard and fast rule. There's individual variation in predatory animals and how they do what they do. And there's nothing like firsthand experiences and practice learning how to do this better, and the same can be said for any kind of sign identification. So without any more further ado, when we think about basic signs for wildlife management, I think about a few things. And for Texas landowners and managers, it comes down to some basic signs. On the top left, you've got an impression of a track there. Tracks are a very important tool for us, both in identifying predation and just what wildlife are present on your property. There are a number of excellent track ID and field guides out there, and truly one can make a lifelong experience from learning tracking. There are some wonderful trackers out there in the world, and I think a couple are signed on with us today, and I think they'll agree that it's a constant learning process. And moving on from that to the top right, I think everybody can probably identify what that is. We have a very scientific term for the deposition of fecal matter on the landscape. We call it scat. Wildlife scat, particularly that from predatory animals, can tell us a whole lot about what's going on. As you can see there, there's a fair amount of hair bound up in that fecal matter, and we can use that hair to identify what the diet of that animal is like at that time of year. Same can be said for plant matter. If you've ever seen coyote scat in the spring, when there's a fair amount of plant matter or seeds in that scat, it helps us key in on what items are being used. Critically important aspect of wildlife management. Now, the two on the bottom kind of go together. So you see on that barbed wire on the left, you've got a tuft of hair that's been caught. And on the right, you see a trail going towards a fence line. In theory, there's a crossing under it. Now, when you do have trails, they can tell you a lot about the animals using them and can give you a targeted place to do a little bit of track identification. But passages under fences, their size and shape can tell you much. And the hair left behind, especially on barbed wire fences, can get you down to the species of the animal that is using that crossing. Aside from using a microscope, there are a number of guides out there that will help you key out a piece of hair to determine what animal it came from. So when we, in the end, think about using these basic signs for wildlife management, there's a lot we can learn about the animals on our property just from that. The same signs can be used when you do have a predation event and you have a carcass on the ground. These are things that you should be looking for in the area. Tracks around the carcass, scat that may be deposited in the local area, especially if it has hair from a mammal in there, as well as hair that's been left in nearby crossings. So we definitely want to remember those. So when you encounter a carcass, there's some first questions you should ask after a kill. The first one is pretty simple. What predators live here? What animals are in my suite of critters I could be thinking about? Now remember, this can change. Over the last number of years, we've seen animals coming back into various parts of the Lone Star State that haven't been present in many years. Mountain lions in some areas of the east, black bears in a number of places have returned. And so naturally from that, after I identify what predators could be there, I ask myself, well, what are the habits and the signs, as we discussed, of each of those? What items should I be looking for to narrow down what I'm encountering? So the next question we ask ourselves is, do we have a history of predatory events? If you've been on a property, or your family has for many, many years, and over the years you've had confirmed incidents of predation by certain animals, well, we can use that to inform what are the more likely candidates that we're experiencing here. And are my other animals acting normally? This is mostly a livestock question. So, for example, I grew up in beef cattle production. That's what my family did. And if you have animals that are typically pretty docile and relaxed, and they're running around very spooky, very abnormally moving, that's a clue that you've had a predatory event as opposed to some kind of natural mortality that was then scavenged upon. So we want to separate those two. And does the target animal, does the killed animal appear healthy? And this goes back to the point I just made. Sometimes we have scavenging events that look like a predation. We would see a dead animal and it's been opened up and we go, oh gosh, it's been killed by something. But perhaps, in fact, it's actually just been predated upon. Perhaps it was an unhealthy animal that died from natural causes, disease, parasites, a number of other problems. So if you do find wounds, especially bite marks, things of that nature, it's important to take a good knife and skin back around those wounds, and you examine for a number of things, bruising and hemorrhaging around those wounds that tell us if the animal was alive or dead when that happened. And particularly on young animals this time of year, if you have lambs or goat kids, or even if you have a deer fawn that's died a little bit later in the year, it's typically wise to open up the stomach and see if they were getting adequate nutrition. Those very young animals should have a stomach full of milk, or at least some evidence of that. It might be that you have an incidence where an animal has been abandoned or malnourished. So we don't want to just jump to predation when in fact we could have scavenging. But that's a set of first questions. So if you've gone through that, you know, gosh, no, it looks like it's a predatory event. It doesn't look like it's a scavenging event. What are some general signs of predation that I want to specifically key in and look at? Well, in order to interpret the evidence before you for the good question of who done it, in the terms of the animal world, there's several things we go to. The list could be much longer, but I key in on a few items. First is bite or claw marks. Do I find evidence, wounds on the animal where it has been bitten, or where claws have been dug into it or scratched along its side? This is pretty helpful in terms of being able to do measurements and figure out what kind of animal caused those wounds, as well as how the wounds were placed along the carcass where that target was. Drags. Has the animal been moved? Now, there are always exceptions, but particularly mountain lions are well known for if they kill an animal in an open area, they'll drag it, very powerful animal, they'll drag it back underneath cover to feed upon it. So drags are important to look for. Has that animal been moved after it was killed? Targeted feeding. Look at the carcass. Does it look like only certain areas have been fed upon, or in terms of viscera, the guts, have certain items been fed upon as opposed to others? So we'll talk about in specific species how that might look, but targeted feeding can tell us a lot about the animal that consumed that animal that had been predated upon, as well as the location of the kill. For example, as I said earlier, mountain lions don't typically kill and leave the animal in open areas. They'll drag it, as opposed to some that might both kill and feed in the same location. Is it a part of the property that animal, according to its ecology and habitat use, would occupy and kill in? Again, there could be a number of other things on the list, but I key in on those. And remember, we're going to go through this today, no system, sign, or interpretation is perfect. There's always individual variations in kills. There's always animals that behave a little bit differently than they should. But we work constantly for more reliable knowledge, gaining better experience for ourselves, and improving our methodology as opposed to just looking at a carcass and making a guess, giving ourselves quantifiable things to look at. So going into some species-specific predation signs, we're going to work through a number today and talk in detail about what you might see. So that discussion will last for a while, and we'll key in on some of those items if you're concerned about predation from particular species, what that might look like. And this is, again, to reiterate the point that predators, at least by species, specialize in modes of killing prey. Remember, these are animals that have been adapted and evolved as pretty efficient animals in terms of killing, right? They're built to do the job that they do. And so they have characteristic ways in which they're adapted to do that. Sometimes it leaves us clues behind that are pretty convincing in identifying predation. You think about the size difference between, if you're in the northern states where they have wolves, a bite from a gray wolf and a bite from a gray fox. Right? It doesn't leave a whole lot of room for discussion in our minds. That's a clue that helps us identify predation just based on scale. So we use these characteristics to inform our management decisions, just so that we know what animals we should be targeting. So we're going to examine a set of common signs, but again, remember, no rules 100%. Kills are tough, and individuals deviate from general trends. I'm going to reiterate that several more times today. So let's start off in our canines. One of the most common questions and common calls I get is for canid predation, typically in the form of coyotes. For livestock raisers, particularly those raising small ruminants, coyote predation is often cited as one of their perceived biggest problems, one of the things they're most concerned about. And those that also concern themselves with the management of ungulates, including deer, are often concerned about coyote predation, often on fawns. So when we examine a carcass and we think it might be predation from a coyote, if we're measuring bite marks, I key in on those. They can be some variation, but around 1.8 inches apart as far as the spacing on the top canines. That's the distance between, if you were to measure it, that you would find. Typically where that killing strike has happened, there's going to be a targeted bite, typically just behind the jaw and below the ear. Many people think that's because the coyote is trying to bite that area and puncture the blood vessels and the arteries there and let a lot of blood out. Ironically, it actually is that suffocation is typically the cause of death. Blood loss, although it's massive, is usually secondary, but being able to hold that animal and suffocate it is a lot more efficient than trying to bite until you get that blood loss. So typically we're going to get a targeted bite right there. They don't always get a positive bite the first time though, so you may have a number of bites in that area that you have to try to set, okay, these two canine bites or bite marks go together. I want to look into those and measure those too. Small prey, when they get particularly small, so lambs and kid goats and deer fawns, a lot of times they'll end up having the skull crushed or the back of the skull crushed as well, just as a scale item between an adult coyote and that small animal. They're going for the throat bite behind the jaw and the ear, but the skull gets caught in there as well, so you'll see a crush. Not in the same way that you would see a skull crushed if an eagle had come upon that animal with talon marks on the skull and the skull case pulled open to get to the brain, just a crush mark behind the back of the skull. So one of the things about coyotes, and again, this is a usual thing, is that they rarely kill in large numbers, so large number of animals, without consuming them. So typically, if you come into a scenario and you've got, say, you're working with sheep and you've got half a dozen sheep dead and they've not been consumed in some fashion, that's usually not coyotes. Again, we have some variation on that theme, but typically that's not a coyote issue. That one's typically associated with feral dog predation. That's one of those characteristics that helps us separate the two, and as we'll talk about in a minute with feral dogs, that can be pretty tough. With a number of our domestic species, and then coyotes' sizes and shapes can get pretty similar, and so sometimes it can be difficult to separate the two, but large number of killed animals without true consumption, aside from mutilation, is not typically coyotes. So I realize this is a lunchtime talk, and I apologize. Identifying predation is a gruesome topic. There are going to be some photos as we go on throughout the talk that are going to show killed animals. I try to do that for every species. I've taken out some of the more graphic ones, but we're going to talk a little bit. Again, if it turns anybody's stomach, I do apologize for that fair warning. So as we look through these photos, I'm going to highlight some areas. Again, here, when we look at the kill on the top left, and here's an arrow for you, we're looking just behind that jaw. So the line of the jaw kind of goes right there. So it's bit below the ear and just behind that jaw. You see what I talked about, multiple punctures along the left side of the line. But again, going for that throat hold, there is some blood loss. You see the hemorrhagic staining around those wounds. That's what I'm talking about. If you get an animal that was alive when it was bitten, it's going to bleed on the inside. A dead animal can't bleed in the same way, so we're looking for that. And again, just for what that looks like in a live situation, that's what we're going for right there. So it's a throat hold. And if you, bonus points to, if anybody noticed, there's actually two coyotes in this picture. There's one on the left and one on the right of that sheep right there. And if anybody recognizes some of these photos, I borrowed from a couple of predation manuals that are out there. Some of these are much older and some are pretty recent, but these are some excellent photos we've used in AgriLife for a number of years. And again, so you come upon an animal and you want to try to assess who done it. The picture on the top right, here you'll see we've identified matching bite marks, upper and lowers, and so you can measure between the center of those marks to try to get a measure of canine spacing. That can be very helpful in terms of identifying the animal doing the kill. So as far as coyotes go, those are some of our more typical signs that we're looking for, kind of typical evidence of predation in those cases. So moving on a little bit to fox species. We have 4 fox species in Texas, but we're only going to talk about 2 today. So kid foxes and swift foxes are fairly small, restricted to the Panhandle and the Trans-Pecos respectively. We don't talk about them much in terms of predation. Today we'll focus on grays and reds. Remember, gray foxes being native to the state of Texas, red foxes having been introduced. So on these guys, there's a fair difference in your canine spacing. On grays, oftentimes it'll be between a 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch spacing between those canines, as compared to reds, which will be somewhere between 11/16 and an inch in spacing between those canines. So fair difference, and if you've ever had two of those animals in the same place at the same time, you know there's a fair significant difference in the size. So typically predation from foxes is going to be on smaller animals. You know, I've seen incidences where coyotes have killed full-grown cattle, which is, again, an extremely large animal compared to a 30-pound coyote. They can, in some situations, do that. It's rare. With foxes, again, though, we're looking at smaller animals, typically poultry, deer fawns, kid goats, lamb, sheep, that kind of thing. They will, however, readily scavenge on larger animals. So foxes are one of those creatures that scavenge readily. Don't confuse seeing a fox on a carcass with the fact that, yes, that animal is the one that did the predating upon. With foxes, again, they're going to try to work for that bite hold on the throat with those mammals, right? And one thing about them, though, you'll often see on the neck, it looks like somebody's perforated it. A lot of bites trying to get that sweet spot hold, and it can often be difficult to pull out those pairs of bite marks. So another couple of things you see is that typically there's very little bone damage when foxes get on an animal. That's just a function of the size and the power of their jaws. It's very difficult for them to break much in the way of bone, as opposed to coyotes, which you'll often see marks, especially on the jaw. You can get punctures into the jawbone of ruminants. So that typically is not something that we see with foxes. On those larger ruminants, you'll still see bites on the throat, but they also may be down the back. Foxes will sometimes, for example, in the case of lambs, get on top of a lamb or a small ewe and bite down the back, trying to do some damage there and bring the animal down. Again, in those cases, it's wise to skin back those wounds and look for evidence of hemorrhagic staining to see if the animal was alive when that occurred. So the thing about foxes, though, is that they generally prefer to consume viscera, particularly when they are scavenging. And oftentimes, if you've got an animal laying sideways on the ground, so you've got one side up, one side down, oftentimes foxes will kind of come under and up and start feeding from the ground side into the carcass as opposed to feeding top down. It's one of the oddities of fox scavenging and can be a clue for us in terms of what the animal is that is doing that. But in general, they prefer viscera. And again, to remind you, viscera just means all the contents of the abdominal cavity, so any of your internal organs. And the thing about red foxes is they have a tendency to take prey animals back to the den sites that they maintain. If they can carry it back, they often will. And so when we have folks that say, gosh, I just have animals missing, right? I went out to my chicken coop this morning and classic story of fox in the hen house, my chickens are just gone. Well, it's an animal large enough or small enough, if you want to look at it that way, that a fox can carry back to the den site. So again, some pictures involving foxes, and forgive the blurriness of the top left photo, but there's some marks here on the carcass in that area that are bite marks down the upper part of the back on that sheet, demonstrating what we talked about earlier. On the top left, again, this is a somewhat larger animal the fox has been scavenging upon but did not kill, and then rabbit on the bottom being carried by the red fox to highlight the ability to carry back to the den site. And again, to remind you, the diet of these animals is typically going to involve rodents and rabbits and things of that scale. So that's, as far as wild diet is concerned, what we're looking like. And so when you find fox scat, if you're looking for that kind of sign, you'll often have a case of incredible amounts of rodent fur in there in the scat. And again, with any of these animals, look around the carcass when in doubt for tracks, scat, and other sign of that nature. So feral dogs. Feral dogs are a question I get pretty frequently. And the issue of identifying predation from a domestic dog that has gone feral or an animal that is free roaming but still belongs to someone and is a pet, it can be pretty difficult. Because of the range of sizes and breeds, canine spacing is highly variable. To give you a range would do very little good because it ranges anywhere from your Chihuahua to your Great Pyrenees to your Mastiff, Irish Wolfhound, that kind of thing. Very difficult in that way. And so it's important to bear in mind that there is a real difference between free-roaming domestic dogs that are somebody's pet and just run around doing their own thing and then come home at night, and true feral dogs that are on the landscape functioning as their own entity, not looking to anyone to provide their food, shelter, or care. And one of the big differences here is that free-roaming domestics tend to mutilate animals, but they don't consume. Feral dogs are looking for a meal, and while they will kill in large numbers and not necessarily eat all of them, they are going to consume. A lot of that targeted feeding that we see is on hindquarters and viscera, pretty typical there, and so we often key into that with our true feral dogs, that they will kill the animal and then feed on hindquarters and viscera. And it can be pretty difficult to separate kills from these animals from young coyote behavior. Young coyotes, particularly in the first year or two of life, are still learning how to do what they're doing, and so you may get a number of kills without a lot of consumption, and you may get some kind of uncharacteristic kills in that way. So other sign can be helpful in making that determination. Or in the case of the gentleman I was working with, I mentioned earlier, game camera was helpful in that instance of trying to identify what the offending animal was, just because there was a lot of overlap in the signs we were seeing in that case. It could have been young coyotes. In his case, it was not. So just some pictures. When I say that these animals are mutilated by free-roaming domestics, some things to point out. So on the top left, you've got a dog attack, so the face has been mutilated. There's a lot of damage done. The neck has been damaged as well. The dog that did this was easily powerful enough to kill that animal, but did not. Same for the top right. That's a horrific injury on this ewe, but at the same time, there was no kill, there was no consumption. It was just mutilation. The same is true for the bottom left. On the bottom right, however, in addition to being mutilated, the mutilation extended to disembowelment, which in the end, the animal was not able to survive. So you do get some death resulting from mutilations, but these are, again, free-roaming dogs that are not truly feral. They're not looking for a meal. They're just indiscriminately toying with these animals. So shifting from the canine world a little bit, now thinking about our felid world. Identification of felid predation from canine predation, there are a couple of things we always look at. And one thing I've neglected to mention with coyotes and to an extent with foxes, as far as looking at the actual bites on the carcass, the way dentition on a coyote, the teeth are set up, the bites are going to look a little more ragged. The feeding habits are going to be a little bit more ragged edge, not as clean. Compared to a mountain lion or a bobcat, the felid teeth actually produce fairly clean edges when biting and consuming flesh on that carcass. So that's one way we can often separate the two, is by looking into that aspect of predation. So with mountain lions, typically you're dealing with a much larger animal, although there's variation across the range of this species. But with canine spacing on those upper canines, you're looking between 1.5 to 2¼ inches in spacing, and the lowers are going to be between 3/8 of an inch and 1/2 inch closer together than those uppers. But remember, tooth wounds in many cases are going to be massive by comparison to the canines we have in Texas, other than some of our domestics, upwards of 3/8 of an inch in diameter. So much larger canine teeth than our canids, if you will. So mountain lions, like most cats, tend to stalk and attack from cover. We mentioned earlier briefly that when these animals do attack out in the open, they will typically take those animals back under cover, drag them back to consume them, and not leave them exposed while they're in the process of feeding. Another thing about felids, and mountain lions are particularly known for it, is that they will try to cover their carcass, right? So cover the carcass, cache it, if you will, twigs, branches, dirt, things of this nature, in order to create something to come back to, right? So you've seen domestic cats try to bury things in the same fashion. It's a felid behavior. You'll often see claw marks on the back, and so with an animal that's been kind of leapt upon by a mountain lion, you'll be able to see wounds, or if you can't see wounds on something like a sheep that bears wool, like a merino or a rampelay, I would encourage you to still skin that carcass back and look for wounds you could not see through the wool. You'll often see claw marks on the back, and you can look at the spacing of those to help determine who done it, if you will. And one thing about mountain lions, sometimes you will get an instance that they do have multiple kills in one event, but that few are fed upon. That is one of those characteristics, but again, you should be able to pick out between a mountain lion and a feral dog kind of which one is the offending animal there. And the thing about mountain lions is they'll often first feed on viscera, but not just any part of the viscera. Oftentimes they will go ahead and remove the intestines, so they'll open up the abdominal cavity, remove the intestines, drag the animal to cover, feed on the viscera, and then go to consuming flesh. And we do see a lot of damage around the back of the neck and the skull and the shoulder muscles, right? So when you think about using those claws, if you can cleave those shoulder muscles or do enough damage, that animal's going to have a hard time moving or standing up. So there's places we typically see heavy damage from mountain lions. There we go. So in terms of looking at some photos that will key us into mountain lion predation, on the top left, when you get animals like this ewe that was dropped in a strange location, so this is not a typical orientation for a carcass to be in. Back to the ground, legs straight up in the air. This was one that was carried by a mountain lion to this location, dropped, and I believe there's some feeding evidence on the other side of the carcass, but you can't see it here. So again, unusual orientation that takes a very powerful animal to do. On the top right, you see an evidence of a deer that was consumed partially, and then you see the evidence of twigs and branches and dirt and things of that nature being piled on in an attempt to cover it. And it's worth noting here that the abdominal cavity has been opened up and quite a bit of viscera consumed. The same on the bottom center photo, you can actually see here, try to highlight that, what's left of the intestines have been pulled out of that deer, and the mountain lion in this case was feeding intensively on the viscera. So that is one thing we look at. And I said you'll see a lot of damage to the back of the head and the neck, and bottom left photo highlights some of that and the massive blood staining and bleeding going on there. When we think about signs for mountain lion, and tracks are always part of it, there are a couple of things to remember and to key in on. So look at the bottom right-hand photo on the screen. That's a grown man holding the paw of a mountain lion in his hands. That is a massive paw. That is very, very large, and one should not consume it or confuse it with a bobcat. The other thing I want to draw your attention to into looking at this paw is that bottom pad. You see how the bottom of that pad there has these three characteristic lobes on the bottom. That can help you out if you've got good clear tracks on the ground and identifying this as a mountain lion track, or at least a felid track, and the scale will help you narrow it down to a mountain lion. We had an incident some years ago where a stock farm raising horses had a couple of foals killed, and they were sending photos of predation, and we'll talk about in a minute. It's always difficult to try to assess a kill from a photo you get later when nobody was there when the animal was actually attacked. In this case, the horse raiser had a very clear photo of a bloody paw print, so kind of like taking your handprint or a baby's foot in ink when you stamp it and they're born. In this case, very clear photo of a very clear track, and we were able to say, yeah, no, that's clearly a mountain lion track, and these three lobes are part of that characterization. So moving down the road to our smaller felids, let's talk about the species-specific signs we've got for bobcats. There are a few that we key in on too. So canine spacing on these animals between 3/4 of an inch to an inch in terms of how far apart we're measuring. And interesting thing about bobcats with the smaller class of animals, especially our smaller ungulates that they can get a hold of, they do kill by strangulation, similar to our coyotes, but bobcats are often pretty good at getting a grip, one bite with a lethal hold and not letting go, as opposed to our canids that will often have to bite multiple times before they clamp down and really get a good strike. So we often see one good bite that has that lethal hold with it. And again, they're generally not going to prey on your much larger animals. It's just not efficient for them. It's not a good risk on their part. But when they do get on a little bit larger prey, you will see those claw marks down the back, trying to do some damage to those shoulder and back muscles to bring that animal down. And again, if you've got very small spacing between claw marks as opposed to much larger for a mountain lion, that can help you differentiate the two. And again, they'll probably feed on viscera, and they may consume the entire animal if it's small, but much like their larger cousins, they will go for some of those visceral contents pretty early on. A strange thing about felids is that they typically don't scavenge as readily as canines. Bobcats are no exception. They will scavenge, but they really do prefer to kill their own. And so they'll kill their own animal and consume it, or at least the parts they want of it in the time frame they've got, and then move on. They will do some scavenging, but it's not as common. And again, when looking at the differences between bite marks on flesh, on meat from a canid predator and a felid predator, the differentiation between clean lines, clean edges on a felid, and much rougher edges from a canid. And again, much like mountain lions, they'll attempt to cover their kills to some extent oftentimes, but it's going to be much less so than mountain lions as a general rule. So, and again, forgive the blurry photos, some examples with felids. So again, a number of these come from sheep. When we look at, on the left-hand side of the screen, that neck, you'll see that a lot of damage has been done to the neck region. A number of those strikes were from claw marks on the back of the body and on the neck. But ultimately, this animal was killed with a positive bite, much like we see on the right-hand side of the top here, and then, of course, where that flesh was skinned back there. So one very strong, powerful bite, and then some consumption later. And you'd see that in the bottom center photo as well. Again, for a scale issue, remember the paw of the mountain lion in the last photo. Compare the bottom left photo. You can just see the thumb of the man holding it there. Same person in both of those photos holding the paws. And in this case, that is a much smaller paw that you're dealing with than with the mountain lion. So moving on to one that is not necessarily terribly common in all parts of the state, talking about our ursids, our bear family, is the black bear. So we've had black bears in Texas. They're native. Many regions of the state, they were extirpated long ago. And now we've started to see numbers come up again in various regions of the state, particularly in the drought we had a few years ago. There were a number of very rapid expansions in terms of young bears looking for places to go. So I wanted to include a little bit of bear sign for people that are maybe concerned that they've had a bear kill. I've been getting a number of calls from East Texas and photos, people saying, gosh, John, I've got a calf that was killed and I'm concerned a bear did it. What should I do? We should talk a little bit about what kills look like from black bears. The records of them are relatively few in Texas, but we do have some good signs from other places to key in on. So again, you're dealing with a much larger animal, typically, when it's a grown bear. And so those canines are going to be 3 to 3.5 inches apart, and the teeth are massive. You've got these very large peg-like teeth, if you will, for the canines. Most of the predations historically have been in spring and summertime, so we're coming on this time of year as bears are coming out of hibernation. And again, livestock predation has been relatively uncommon in Texas in the past. One of the things to recognize about a black bear is that it is an omnivorous animal, and although animals like coyotes are known for consuming large amounts of vegetative material at different times of year, black bears make a habit of being omnivorous, so they're not exclusively a carnivore. But when you do see a kill from a black bear, oftentimes broken necks, backs, and pelvis are common. Bears will often kill with a very powerful strike from their paw, striking that animal down, and so you'll often see these kind of characteristic breaks, usually claw marks associated with them, but there's just really no other animal we have that's capable of doing that, so that kind of massive damage. And usually, so they'll knock them down with these powerful blows, but then the death blow is actually going to come from a bite to the head and shoulders. Again, looking for those areas that are critical of the survival of that animal, and dealing that death blow there. Claw marks are going to be very large and widely spaced on our adult bears. And one thing about bears that they'll often do is there's not a lot of skeletal damage necessarily, and they have a habit of peeling back the skin, peeling it off in sections, but not consuming it. So you may find a small amounts of skin scattered around the animal, not like leftovers from a coyote scavenging or predation, but in fact removed to get to the flesh underneath it. It's one of those strange characteristics of black bear predation. If you do have a lactating animal, particularly, again, spring and summer, when a number of our ungulates and small ruminants are lactating to feed their young, often the first thing that is consumed is the udder, right? The milk there in the udder is highly palatable and highly nutritious, so the bears will consume udders on those lactating animals. Carcasses are rarely scattered. So when we deal with predation from coyotes, for example, they're famous for pretty messy eaters, if you will. They scatter the carcass, particularly when you have multiple animals involved. Black bears rarely do. They will leave the carcass in one place, consume it there, and not move anything around. So again, a few photos, and again, forgive some of the photos for being old, but highlighting here on the top right and the bottom right that udders have been consumed first. And on the bottom right, this animal is still alive, and udders were consumed, and part of the haunches were consumed out of it. When we think about, okay, do I have black bear predation, we really want to look for signs of bear in the area before jumping to any conclusion. So again, important signs to look for are always tracks. I've got a photo on the next slide that's a better image. And also, bears are known for marking trees, right, with their claws. So look on the bottom left in that area I've highlighted, particularly if you're in the eastern part of our state where you have a fair number of trees of large size. Look for bear claw marks on trees marking territory. So we definitely want to see if we've got bears in the area. Coming back to our very first question of what predators are present. And again, for a better image on those tracks, it's here are the tracks of the black bear, remembering, of course, and let's look back at the hind and the front. So on the bottom here, the right hand is the right hind foot, this longer pad. So bears walk on the pad of their foot. We call it plantigrade, same as you and I that walk on the bottom pad of our foot. And then on the left, we have that right front foot. So the thing about a bear is that you'll see that the hind foot on this one is actually placed in front of the front foot. Bears, in that way, they cross over, and so you'll often see a heavier step on the front foot here, and then the hind crosses over, and then the opposite is true moving onward. So particularly if you have good soils, soft soils, anything that you can read tracks in well, if you have a kill that you suspect being due to a black bear, we really need you to look for sign in the area. Critically important there. Okay, so we're going to move on a little bit and talk some about sign that we often see from birds of prey and birds of carrion, if you will, our scavenging birds. So there are a variety of predatory birds in Texas, and we have fortunately a great diversity of avian life, and birds of prey are no exception. But remember, in terms of you as managers, livestock producers, or wildlife managers, that most of our predatory birds are migratory and or protected by various state and federal statutes. So your ability to manage them or to dissuade predation, be careful of what techniques you're using. Please make sure that you're not doing anything outside of the law. So going through a few, owls are often referred to as like the tigers of the sky in Texas. They're incredible predators, very efficient. They're pretty intense predation on small animals that they get on, rabbits, house cats, often a number of game birds, things of that nature. There's very little evidence often left behind because owls consume that animal whole and then go somewhere else and regurgitate what they can't eat of that animal, bones and all. So if you do have a tree that owls are roosting in and you see that consistently, or an old barn, you can go and find what we call owl pellets and see what's wrapped up in there to see what they've been eating, much in the same way you would look at scat. But again, there's very little evidence often left behind. But again, with most of our birds, they're consuming smaller animals. Eagles, we have both bald and golden eagles that migrate through the state. If you do find evidence of damage to an animal, especially if you've got small ruminants that are being injured, often you'll get these kind of characteristic tear-shaped talon marks along the back and the skull. So one strategy used by eagles in some parts of their range is to do intensive injury to the back of an animal, wait for those wounds to fester, get gangrenous, wait for the animal to die, and then consume it. But you will see this kind of intense damage. And oftentimes you'll see two characteristic things from eagles, that they'll open the brain case along with these skull injuries I'm talking about and feed upon the brain. Very powerful beaks, they can open those up. And they'll often skin out their prey. So you'll see animals that look like they've been pulled inside out, or at least part of them has. And that's kind of characteristic for eagle predation, goes along with those talon marks. You'll also see something with eagles, and I've got a photo of it here in a second, which I call rib clipping. So you'll see the spinal cord or the vertebra along what's left of the animal, but it'll look like somebody took a pair of loppers and just snipped the ribs off right at the spine. Again, the eagle's got a very powerful beak and capable of doing that. And when they predate upon birds, you'll often see the feathers have been plucked out from the birds and left in the vicinity. So, in other birds of prey that we've got, folks think about hawks quite often, particularly if you're a manager of game birds or primarily interested in our small birds, quail, things of that nature. Hawks are a large source of predation on those types of animals, and they do mostly feed on smaller prey, birds, mice, lizards, things of that nature. They're not typically going to go and injure our larger mammals like eagles might. And they are, again, the subject of great concern for game bird managers, but to be honest with you, with them being migratory, there's not a lot you can do with them. There's often not a lot of sign left behind except for perhaps parts of a quail or things of that nature left. We had a study at a point on quail. We had a number radio tagged, and we had a Cooper's hawk take a quail away, and the only thing that was left was a leg with a band attached to it and just a little bit of meat above that leg. I get a number of calls about crows and ravens in terms of, well, what damage, John, can they do? With these animals, we'll see a couple of things. If they're predating upon nests, you'll either see the egg can be removed entirely, or you'll see small round holes poked in the egg, and they'll consume the materials out of there. On mammals, they typically go for the young and the defenseless, so freshly born fawns, kids, lambs, things of that nature, and they're going to target those easy kind of soft tissues, so the eyes, the nose, navel area, and the anus. And oftentimes, if you've got animals that do survive that, they'll be missing eyes and things of that nature, so crows and ravens can do that. And then, of course, the question I get all the time from people is about vultures. Can vulture predation happen? Remember, we have both black and turkey vultures here, and a lot of the targeted areas for them to feed upon are similar to crows and ravens, particularly along the Texas coast. You'll have black vulture consumption of eyes from newborn calves. That can be quite a source of problems. But remember that turkey vultures, although they don't often kill. They generally scavenge very quickly after an animal dies, but we're really focusing more on black vultures doing the killing. And so for some photos of these birds of prey that we talked about, again, on the top left, you can see the head and neck of what's left of this lamb from an eagle attack. So we've got talon marks and fractures all along there. You can read the caption. This is from an old AgriLife publication. And so you can see the massive damage done to that head. As I explained with the hemorrhaging and the marks along the back, on the top right, you'll see we've got this kind of staining and the incredible damage done to those shoulders. You would not necessarily have seen those talon marks if you had skinned the animal back, but in this case we have. More hemorrhaging on the bottom left. And then the rib clipping I wanted to talk about is the bottom right photo there. If you can see that, again, it looks like somebody came along with a pair of loppers or shears and just clipped them right off. That's a pretty characteristic sign of eagle predation, eagle feeding. And one thing I wanted to point out very quickly, because I do get questions about it quite often, venomous snakes. So on most wildlife and livestock, venomous snakes are not predatory. They're not looking to consume an entire deer fawn, at least the venomous snakes we have in Texas, right? A lot of times when we do get death, it's resulting from a strike to an animal that it perceived as a threat. The snake ended up striking and the animal got injured. So when we do have these dead animals, you'll see if an animal died from a snake bite, you'll have a wound that is often swollen, dark, and necrotized. The tissue's been dying when you skin the animal back. So if you look at the photo on the right, there is an arrow to that bottom area that looks very black and kind of Icarus. And that travels up the leg and onto the front of the animal. And again, you'll see that tissue is black and dying. That's evidence that it was bitten by a venomous snake and perhaps died of that injury. Not always, but perhaps. So to kind of bring us back around, we have to talk about critically evaluating the carcass. We've gone through some specific examples, but again, we want to look at what injuries do I have from what animals, because you'll often get a number, and do they occur before or after death? Look for hemorrhagic staining around those wounds. Measure tooth and claw distances, keep a record of that, and that'll help us get down to the meat and potatoes of what species are we looking at, and other signs or behaviors. Again, nothing's ever 100%, but if a kill was just not characteristic for a certain type of animal, we might want to think about other options. And before you jump to saying that it was definitely predation, there are a number of other items that could be causes of death we want to rule out. Parasites, we experienced very high parasite loads from this last very wet spring we had, so animals were in a little bit worse shape already. Disease issues may be at fault here. Issues in either pregnancy or birthing. So you can have a cow, for example, that's having a hard time having that calf. She lays down, just cannot have the animal. She's in bad shape, and she may be subject to predation or just die of her own natural causes and then be scavenged upon, poisoning, various other things. We want to make sure it's not just an animal that's been scavenged, but is indeed an animal that was predated upon before we try to go forward with any management ideas. And so I always put photos up and I go, who done it? So this is a question. I had this photo sent to me a while back, and often I just get one picture and somebody says, who done it? So we walked through the different signs we had. So the first thing I said is, okay, where is this kill at? Oh, it's out in the open. Oh, in a Bermuda pasture. Okay, very good. Where are the front legs? Oh, man, they were pulled off in 2 different directions. Okay, it was scattered. Gotcha. And when I took this photo, let me change colors so you can see my cursor. I think pink will work. We take this photo and we zoomed in on the neck, for example. And you can see there's a puncture mark right there, and I got a closer photo sent to me. Yes, indeed, there was a good hold on the throat. The consumption along the rib cage is very rough. It's very ragged and pretty characteristic of canid consumption, as is on the back haunch there. And all in all, pretty characteristic of a coyote kill on this calf. And so we had to walk through those different signs we had, and I asked the owner, I said, well, can you find me other sign in the area? I didn't have to go very far before he found coyote scat that indeed had the hair from this calf in it. So we were able to use some of those tools to critically evaluate what happened here. In the end, it's just to say that we want to work on gaining more reliable knowledge. We want to improve our skills of identifying predation every time it happens and never jump to conclusions. So we want to always remember to get ourselves as much data as we can, right? Be a scientist in the sort of identifying the sign before you. So how do we do that? Well, one, if you've got a fresh kill, please cover it as quickly as possible to minimize insect activity as well as minimize scavenging from other animals. And we want to record, okay, what species of animal was it? How old was it? What sex was it? And what was its condition? Was it in poor shape already? What was the scenario? Was it out in the open? Was it in a closed area? Night, day? What's the size of the pasture it's in? Everything that's going on. We want photos of the area if we can help it, particularly if you're sending them to someone to help you identify the kill. And if possible, when somebody calls me, I say, man, please get me some good photos, not blurry, but pretty clear of the whole body. If you've got wounds that you can identify, please skin them back and put something in the photo for scale. It doesn't always have to be a ruler. It could be a pocket knife. It could be a number of things. But let us know generally how bigger is the thing that we're looking at. Where are the viscera, right? Where are the internal organs? And what's their disposition? Like we talked about with mountain lions, have the intestines been pulled out and deposited elsewhere? Or is everything together? Has the abdominal cavity even been opened? Are there any drags or trails in the area? Get me photos of everything, or keep photos for yourself so you can go back and evaluate it later. It's too easy after we have an event that we look at something, we have an idea, we don't touch the animal or take photos, and 2 days later we're thinking about it going, I wonder, I should go back and look again. Maybe there was something I missed. Well, the animal's probably been scavenged heavily by that point. We probably can't. So we want to take as much data as we can to help inform our management. And to make a point, in Texas, we have both native and non-native predators. And I put up a variety here. I don't always get to talk about the venomous snakes and the birds of prey in my talks. But to make the point of, if I'm thinking about the effects of predation, there are animals for whom predation was built into the system. They are part of the natural system. However, I have 3 photos on the screen that are not part of the natural system. Feral hogs, feral dogs, and feral cats. Those 3 were not built to be in the system. The system was not designed for them. And so when we think about the effects of predation, before I ever go to working on native predators, I want to think about managing those animals first. I want to minimize their existence on the landscape. So I try to help the system function better before I take out part of it from a native standpoint. And so again, to kind of wrap up, we've got some sources for help out there in the state. You've got a number of people that you can call on who are tremendously experienced in identifying predation. Wildlife Services, it's their federal organization that in Texas also is kind of part of the AgriLife system. You might know them better as your county trappers or your federal trappers. Those guys are wonderful at being able to identify predation. They do it for a living. They're very experienced. A number of your Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service agents have got a fair amount of experience doing this, and forgive me, anybody from Parks and Wildlife, somehow Parks and Wildlife did not end up on there. Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, there are a number of biologists who are fantastic trackers, identifiers of kills, and various other signs. They are professional biologists. Call upon them. If you've got a trapping club in your area, maybe you've got some neighbors who have experience. And there are also text and online resources. So drawing your attention, I put an image up on the screen that's tremendously blurry, my apologies, but it is a guide that AgriLife Extension published some years ago called Procedures for Evaluating Predation on Livestock and Wildlife. This will walk you through a number of the signs and keys I talked about today and go into much more depth than we have time for. So there's a link there on the screen that I believe Clint will repost in the chat. And we have, in that case, an ability for you to go online and request it and have it sent to your home. It's a paper product, 20-ish pages, I think. Fantastic resource. So again, doing everything we can to get more reliable knowledge about identifying predation. And so with that, I will say thank you. I always like putting my Wile E. Coyote card up on the screen, but if you've got any questions, I'd be happy to take them at this time, and maybe Clint will help me out in making sure I cover all of those.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, John. A lot of great information there. We have a couple questions that have come in, and I would encourage everybody, we've still got time. If you want to post some questions up, I'll relay them to John. The first is, what about identifying feral hog?
Very good question. So feral hog predation, I did not get a chance to go into, so it varies is the answer. Feral hogs are opportunistic omnivores, and they may, with an animal, they don't often go for very large animals, so it's going to be something smaller, along the lines of a deer fawn. With feral hogs, it's hard to say. They'll often indiscriminately consume the carcass, and they may consume pretty much all of it. I have seen hog-killed carcasses where they manage to peel the skin back somewhat, but it's pretty rough, to be honest with you. But they tend to be fairly clean eaters, and that they don't scatter it the same way coyotes do. And you'll see a lot of hog sign in the area when they do consume a carcass, so look for tracks and scat and things of that nature. And again, in the guide that I mentioned, there's a lot more information in detail. Apologies for not including that in today's talk.
Okay, what about carcasses? Some people say that they do predate on fawns and things like that.
They do. So crested carcasses, I would fit in kind of with my category of black vultures. They're often scavenging animals, but they are very efficient predators of game birds as well, and they can predate on lambs. I've had it happen since I've been here in San Angelo in the last year. We did have a producer who was having issues, and I went out to his property. I witnessed carcasses killing a lamb last spring. So it can happen, but remember, they are protected under state and federal statute as migratory birds.
All right, I think that's all that we have so far. I have a couple quick things, and again, please continue to post up questions if you have them. The link that I posted appears to be broken, but we have a working link there, so if you'd like to get a copy of that publication, there is a good link for it there. Excuse me, the next webinar that we have coming up is going to be in April, the third Thursday of April. I'm sorry, I don't have the date in front of me, but it's going to be on getting to know your quail. It's going to be presented by Dr. Dale Rollins, also with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. I'm going to post up a link real quick, actually a couple links for you. The first one that I'm putting up here is a link to all of the webinars, the topics to come up in all of 2016. If you want to bookmark that, hold on to it. We've got a lot of really good topics coming up this year. The second link I'm posting here is where you will find this webinar archived. And so hopefully at the very beginning of next week, I'll get this webinar archived. You can go back, look through all the information. You'll hear the presentation, see it just like you did today, as well as the questions at the end. So with that, John, I think they're going to let you off easy. I don't see any other questions coming in.
Well,
do you have anything else?
I'm easy to find. You can just Google my name or Google Wildlife Specialist Texas A&M, and you can find me. I'm here in San Angelo, and I've got a cell phone, and I can't run from you. So feel free to call anytime, and whatever I can do to help you out, I'd be happy to.
And we did have one quick one come in. Do you have a general assumption on how often scavenging is misdiagnosed as predation?
Extremely often. I won't put a percentage to it, but probably I would say the majority of the calls I get when a person has an idea of who the offending animal was, it's often been scavenged intensively by that animal, but the predation was not done by that animal. So it's pretty often misdiagnosed.
All right. Well, I guess we'll end it with that. Really appreciate it, John. I really appreciate all of you who tuned in today. Please remember that you can go back and watch this archived as well as all of our other webinars that have been archived. And with that, we will let you all go. Thank you once again.
Thanks, everybody.